I'm Deepak Chopra, and we're continuing our series with luminaries, influencers, sages, scientists, people who are making a great difference on our planet right now, which seems to be in a bit of a trouble with climate change, eco-destruction, extinction of species, war, terrorism, chronic disease, and much, much more. And today it's my distinct pleasure to welcome my dear friend Matt Harris, who was the co-founder of Global Infrastructures, but is now on to something totally new, regenerative infrastructure as a key to the future of our planet. And I was looking at some of what he said in the past, and here's a quote: "Uncontrolled waste, dwindling natural resources, water and food scarcity, biodiversity destruction and species extinction, weather catastrophes, skyrocketing rates of anxiety, addiction, and loneliness, economic inequality, divided communities, and nations at war." This is a direct quote from Matt Harris. And if you are to believe what he's saying, then it looks like we're sleepwalking to extinction, and that the human species may have been an interesting evolutionary experiment that didn't work. I hope that's not the case. Welcome, Matt Harris.
Deepak, thank you. Always good to be with you, and looking forward to our discussion today.
So I know people, when they see our conversation, they'll have access to your bio and your previous achievements. So I'm not going to mention any of that right now, other than the fact that you're actually ahead of the curve. While we are talking about sustainability, you're talking about regeneration. I've been going to the World Economic Forum, looking at all the conversations around sustainability, protection of marshlands, agroforestry, protection of indigenous people's rights, new ways of harnessing energy and distributing it, new transportation systems, but yet going beyond that. So please talk to me about regenerative infrastructure, which goes beyond sustainability.
So I think sustainability is, omnipresent today in the zeitgeist, and corporations, individuals, countries are all focused on sustainability. I believe it has some fundamental limitations. It's certainly better than where we've been, but not as good as or necessary as to where we can get to. A couple of things. One, sustainability generally still views the natural world, still views the earth as a resource to be extracted from. And while the practices of doing that are much better, what it fails to recognize, in my opinion, is the interdependence and interconnection of everything that lives on this planet. And if you look at much of the natural world, as I call it, as distinct from the human species, although they all are one big operating system, you'll see many, many examples in nature of regeneration, of how life begets life, how life evolves and grows and changes and always becomes a new version of itself, right? I think this birth-death cycle that you talk about so often, Deepak. And so what I think we're missing as a human species is an acknowledgement of that, that it needs, in my opinion, to be brought into our consciousness in a way that we recognize the importance of that interdependence. And if we do that, I think we'll start to recognize that many of the practices we have today that inform our built world would need to change. And we need to stop externalizing the costs of a lot of these things that we're doing and build them into the products, the systems, the infrastructure that we're designing and building. And you could think of, of capitalism. I think of capitalism as the best system there is. And inherently, whether it's a large cat on the plains of the Serengeti or a human, we're wired to actually invest the least amount possible and get the most out, right? There's call it a built-in margin in there. And capitalism, I think, recognizes that. But could there be a new version of that where, in addition to profit for profit or other ways of thinking about it, could we incorporate these regenerative practices and this idea that we're all part of an interdependent system? Regenerationism could be a name that you might want to use for it. And I think in designing our built world, and I've spent most of my career, Deepak, in infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transportation and mobility, water and waste, now digital infrastructure, things like mobile cell towers, data centers, fiber, all of the things that make our everyday life possible. Can we start to design those in a more circular way, in a more regenerative way? And what does that look like? I don't think we know all the answers to this, but our species is unique in that we actually have the ability to think about and to manifest things that we don't necessarily know the answers to yet. And that's the idea behind this regeneration principle. And I'm particularly interested in how do we build it into the infrastructure that we live with.
And you have a vehicle for this already. Do you have a business plan that is already in execution for regenerative infrastructure?
Yeah, I have something called the Bedari Collective, Bedari, which is, effectively the platform that I'm developing around this concept, with 5 really key areas that we're focused on. One is investment, capital formation. 2, community, because I think community is a very important element of regenerative practices. 3 is research, education, and convening. 4 is policy, and 5 is technology. Technology has a really important role to play, in my opinion, in designing the kind of next generation and next generation after that of infrastructure. And we have, Deepak, a very unique opportunity to think about this, because where we sit in the world today, there is increasing acknowledgement that climate change and other planetary boundaries have reached a point where we have to decarbonize. And as I travel around the world, there's more and more acknowledgement that that is the case. And we can see the impact of it, right? You talked about a little bit when you opened the discussion, whether it's fires, floods, you name it, the impact of climate change is becoming increasingly pervasive. So acknowledgement of decarbonization. We've all been the beneficiaries of this fossil fuel economy for the last 250 years, whatever it is. So we're all part of the problem, if you will. It's not a we versus they thing, in my opinion, but we have to recognize that we need to come up with a different way of doing this. Otherwise, we are going to face an increasingly grim future. So, by my estimations, and there's lots of data out there from Bloomberg and others, there's about $100 trillion of expenditure over the next 25 years that's required to start to really decarbonize the way we live. Everything from the way we transport ourselves, the way we produce electricity, how we make cement and steel, how we make chemicals, all of this decarbonization is an infrastructure story. It requires new infrastructure. So it's a very unique moment in time to actually think about designing that infrastructure which is going to get built. I can see increasing evidence of that. It will ebb and flow for sure. It will take longer. It'll cost more, but it is going to get built. So let's start designing that in a regenerative way. That's what we're trying to work with.
Matt, Bedari Collective has a website, I assume.
They do, yeah, they do.
We can put a link to that website for,
of course,
many of the people who will be watching this. Ultimately, 25 million and LinkedIn over 1 million, etc. So I think we should give the people an opportunity to look at your website and maybe even weigh in. What do you think?
Absolutely, happy to do that. We're looking for all the help we can get. There's no easy path, and it's going to be a collective process for sure.
I was thinking, and maybe you're familiar with this. I have been going to a place in upstate New York called Omega for the last 35 years. And the last time I visited them, which was about less than 10 years ago, Omega now has a recycling facility where human waste, including, toilet waste, urine, feces, every kind of human waste, including garbage, is recycled into not only energy and electricity, but also for the growth of plants and the feeding of fisheries. I don't know if you've been to Omega.
I have not. It's long been on my list of places to visit. I have not, but certainly heard about it, Deepak.
Yeah, it's a good example of what you're saying, going beyond regenerative, going beyond sustainability into what nature is, not only sustainable, but as you said, regenerative.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of community-based elements to regeneration. It's particularly applicable in the developing world. We've done projects in Bhutan. We're working on one now in Rwanda, really trying to target three pieces of the equation. One is conservation and biodiversity. Two is climate resilience, right? Because the climate change is causing all kinds of things to happen that require resilience to be designed into the infrastructure. And then the third is economic, empowerment, economic opportunity to increase the standard of living. How are we doing that? We're doing that by creating protected areas, building in new infrastructure such as rainwater reclamation, renewable energy, batteries, digital access, new forms of regenerative agriculture, all of which can lead to economic opportunity at a community and even greater level. And President Kagame has been a big supporter of what we're trying to do in his country and has put a team against it to try to develop this concept to a significant degree around the 4 national parks that they have in Rwanda. So it is a great example, what you cited at Omega, and everything from water reclamation to renewable energy to circular economy for recyclability of things like solar panels, which today most solar panels go into a landfill as opposed to being recycled, either to be reused again and upgraded as a solar panel or to be used for the materials that are embedded in the panel itself.
Omega is a small community, but actually it has all the elements you're talking about. Sustainable agriculture, a bit of agroforestry, an element of marshlands and protecting fisheries and marine life, and generating electricity and sustainable energy. So I think Omega being right next door is worth a visit. The other thing I was thinking as you were speaking, there is a whole school of thought which talks about emergence, which says that when we have shared vision, when we have maximum diversity of talent and opinion and science and technology, when we have an ecosystem where we support everybody's strengths and where we can create a emotional and spiritual connection between the participants, then we can solve any problem. Now, I came to this idea of emergence or learned about it through my own experience in medicine. We have a system called grand rounds. When we have a patient that is seemingly incurable and we don't know what to do, notwithstanding all the knowledge now we get from AI and other sources, when we bring together physicians from disparate disciplines, not just the specialties, but say you have a cancer patient, you bring in a person who's not only a cancer specialist, but a generalist, an endocrinologist, a neurologist, a psychologist, a humanitarian, a therapist, an acupuncturist, a nutritionist, all of them together, and then present the patient. Invariably, we find a solution, which we can't even find through AI in its present form. So, in that spirit, I want to have the ability to introduce you to these two futurists that I've been talking about. And they wrote a book in the past about the future of our civilization, and including the um, future of transport systems, energy systems, but also concrete and buildings and all of that. And now they've come up with a new book called Stellar
Mm.
and A World Beyond Limits and How to Get There. And here's actually your friend Mukesh Ambani has endorsed the book, but so have a lot of other people, James Airbib and Tony Seba. And the book Stellar basically begins with your idea that it is life that is both tenacious and fragile. You know, there's a phrase, life is tenacious and fragile like a dewdrop on a trembling leaf. But somehow the tenacity of life overpowers all its fragility. And life begins on this planet with the sun, you know, and photosynthesis is, which is a quantum phenomenon, is the basis of all life, you know, all nutrition, but all life begins with photosynthesis. And the richest source of life is actually under the soil called the microbiome, which is the gene expression of life, which gave rise to all life, plant life, animal life, ultimately primates and humans. So if you're amenable, I'd like to connect you to these guys. They are futurists, and they do talk about life as the prime source of regeneration, recycling, and evolution. Uh,
I would be delighted to connect with them, and
because
I think you've really nailed it, right? Because this idea of life of consciousness and being able to really connect to that, and the community gathering you talked about of the doctors, right? There's a consciousness that's evident in that gathering, and the knowledge that arises out of it. You know, it is scientific, but it also can be, you know, wisdom and mystery. And I think this whole process, you know, ever since the, you know, 300 years ago, right, we've lived in this very reductionistic, you know, approach to society, and it's served us very well. We've increased the standard of living. I mean, the things that we have access to. And I don't think we're going back to something that existed before that, but how do we move to, you know, the next plane on the plateau, if you will, in terms of identifying what we need to do as a species to come into greater harmony with the overall planet. And that includes what we build on the planet. How do we build in harmony? How do we make things happen in harmony? There's great work being done around wildlife corridors and wetlands restoration, mangroves for flooding. I mean, there are many solutions to this if we start to think in that direction. One of the things that will be essential, Deepak, is to start to connect up the market mechanisms to ultimately support regeneration. Today, if you are a corporation, you are not yet incentivized fully to abate the carbon that might exist in your industrial process, because the cost of carbon abatement is higher than the cost of simply leaving it in your industrial process. But I think that's going to have to change as we see more and more impact. And you're going to start to get market signals that suggest that certainly sustainability and carbon abatement, but actually going further than that. And my hope is that much the way over the last 25 years, solar energy, which is pretty obvious that that's regenerative, right? So is wind, so are the tides. I mean, these are part of the cycle of life. Solar energy is the cheapest form of new energy on the planet today, something we call the levelized cost of energy. So the LCOE for solar is cheaper than any other form of energy. That's encouraging, right? And what we then have to do is think about, okay, if you go backwards from the point that we generate the energy, is the process by which we're generating that, the mining, the extraction, how do we make that more regenerative? How do we get that to be in a greater position of being circular? So there's a lot of really good work being done across this entire space. But I think we need to continue to bring attention to it and show lawmakers, politicians, academics that this is not something that's pie in the sky. It's actually sits in and around us every day.
But I think the emphasis on life as the starting point and everything built around life, not just human life, but life in general, because human life is entangled with the ecosystem of life and all organisms, from bacteria to plants to animals and primates and humans. And this is something that you just spoke about. You have to get out of the reductionist mindset. And you say, I'm looking at some of the things you've said: energy and power, mobility and transportation, food and agriculture, water and waste. All of it forms the day-to-day framework that has allowed humans to progress and thrive. But not only humans, all of life needs this. And even the examples of transportation and food and agriculture can come from living systems.
No question. And everything can benefit if it is thought about and created in a way that really pays respect to the sacred, the sacred aspect of life.
You also talk about the emerging building blocks of regeneration and infrastructure, including waste and other existing sources, restoring proactively biodiversity, habitat intersections, and designing in ways that mimic natural processes, and much, much more. So, and you do mention that there are a lot of movements. There's also an organization in Florida called the Future of Cities that a friend of mine is embarking on, or has a infrastructure. And I think I would love for you, the Future of Cities, these guys, the futurists, perhaps we can have a panel at the next Sages and Scientists, which is in September, going into these, and even come up with a plan to create online and offline communities to support this idea of regenerate. What's the word you use?
Regenerationism.
Regenerationism. So I think I'm going to work on that, trying and putting people together. My job is just being a connector with all of you who are spearheading this whole idea of resurrecting life. So, notwithstanding all the confusion right now in the world, with war and conflict, even that is related to social economic disparities, to the fact that hunger is still there in the world.
Yep.
and to the fact that there's a lot of exploitation. So regeneration must apply to creative solutions for all of these things: war, terrorism, mechanized death, peace, prosperity.
No question. I think the economics of the entire concept are important because wealth inequality, disparities around income origination. You have to show people that this idea of regenerationism and regenerative infrastructure can actually improve their livelihoods. So that's one reason why when we think about the three things that are really essential to this idea of regenerative infrastructure, we have one is resilience, two is efficiency, and three is reduced carbon intensity. And it's important that it be deployed not only at scale, but also at a local community level. I think one of the ways you address what you just talked about is to really invest in community solutions around regeneration. Your doctors gathering at which solutions were arrived at that maybe would not have been arrived at if that group had not come all together, will come together in community. The art of the possible will become apparent. So community is very important. The economics of all this are very important. And we've been doing a lot of really good work, both on the for-profit investment side, but also on philanthropic capital, venture philanthropy with groups like the Rockefeller Foundation, aimed at developing this kind of regenerative programming, really around the world. I would also say you certainly have a role as a connector, but you also have a very important role because ultimately at the nexus of all this is this connection to life and this idea of consciousness, and that we are all this interdependent being effectively functioning on this planet. And if we can arrive at that, expansion, that growth, that place where we recognize that, these solutions become easier. Now, that's no easy feat. And humans have been at work on this for quite some time, but it feels like there's an increasing number of people that see the potential here.
I was thinking, as you were speaking right now, that what you're talking about is an entirely new paradigm, from a reductionist to a whole systems model for the entire world. And right now, the old model has kind of reached its peak, in the sense that everybody is fighting for resources. Everybody is in ideological conflict. And unless there's a complete new creativity means death of the old concepts, contexts, meanings, relationships, and stories, death and a resurrection of a new story. Fundamental creativity is what we need. And it's not even hope or despair, it's fundamental creativity that is already inherent in nature, in consciousness. And if we can do that, if we can create a new story, this will require an insurmountable galvanization of collective consciousness, and also financial economic shift in how we prioritize spending. You mentioned $100 trillion, I think, in earlier this conversation. So there needs to be big funds, big people coming around this, economic structures coming to this, and a way to galvanize this new story, not only through social networks as we're doing, but through educational institutions, through our new storytellings in movies and in entertainment and in colleges and schools, and essentially what you're talking about is a critical mass of a shift in consciousness that is interested in one simple word, in life.
Yeah,
And so, do you think we can do it?
I do. I absolutely do. I think the arc of consciousness is upward and to the right. I am hopeful. I think that we don't have to know all the answers, right? I mean, I think that's the amazing thing about life itself, right? It comes up with the answers if you just allow it to do its thing. I do think technology plays an important role in this. AI and machine learning can unlock a lot of efficiencies and other avenues in the infrastructure that we live with, and you can do things that require less electricity, that generate recyclability, that generate circularity. So technology deployed into this whole equation has a role, and I think you probably share this. I mean, I don't think it's any accident that we as a species have been able to evolve and develop the technologies that we have. The question becomes, how do they get deployed into this idea of life being sacred, and how do we perpetuate that through technology and using it responsibly and well?
I know, are working with Prime Minister of Bhutan and also with BRK Engels. You've had many conversations. You think there will soon be a model that we can actually look at? Maybe it's the Kingdom of Bhutan or other communities on a smaller scale, Omega. But the more models we have of what you're talking about as regenerative infrastructure, the more enthusiasm we can build around this.
I think there are more and more models coming. I think there are a lot today. You mentioned some of them. I'm very optimistic about what the king is doing in Bhutan as an example of how you really create, this idea of mindfulness and consciousness with the built world and the natural world, how they all interact together. I think there's a lot of good writing on the topic, increasing interest from academic institutions. I've been talking to Columbia a lot about this. We sponsored a course on regenerative economics at Columbia last year. So it's coming. Your idea, though, of community engagement, gatherings, and continuing to kind of convene and talk about it is very, very important.
Do you think crypto has a role in this whole movement?
I do. I think the idea of decentralization, which drives things closer to the community level, whether that be energy or money, absolutely has a role. Now, again, all of this is a function of what level of consciousness do you bring to it and how you design the system to arrive at this regenerative approach. But I absolutely think it does.
Well, as we're speaking, and we look forward to your participation with the others that I mentioned in September at Sages and Scientists, but maybe we can convene a one-day conference just around this in New York City, even earlier than this, bringing yourself and other luminaries like these guys and the Future of Cities and the Prime Minister of Bhutan, Omega, all of these people together to do a little bit of brainstorming even before the Sages and Scientists in New York City. If you're amenable, I'll put the wheels in motion.
For sure. That sounds like a great idea. I'd be happy to help organize and contribute to its formation.
Any last words for our audience before we close?
Well, I think the one thing I would say is, sometimes we take for granted the importance of infrastructure, right? We show up every day and we get to work on a car, an airplane, or a train, and we come home and we turn a switch and our electricity is on. We flush the toilet or we turn our tap on and we turn our internet on. There's Marvin Harris had a great a cultural anthropologist had an interesting system that he talked about. You have a sort of superstructure that exists which represents belief, the belief system that, you know, any particular society, you know, adopts. The structure underneath that, which is generally going to be, you know, education, government, you know, judicial systems, legislative systems, and then underneath that, all the infrastructure that really enables your daily life. So what we're really talking about here is how do we continue to improve the way we live? I do think, Deepak, more and more people are aware of the, and Johan Rockstrom at the Potsdam Institute has done great work around identifying the 9 planetary boundaries and where we stand in each. More and more people are aware that, you know, the current trajectory is not sustainable. And so my call to action is to, you know, to get interested in it, to get to understand, you know, how the built world that we rely on really works. How can we improve it, how we can change it, and how we can make it more interdependent with everything that exists on the planet. I mean, you only have to go to the ocean and watch how people react, right? The healing from the ocean. You go out to nature and see how people respond. So what we're talking about, as you said so eloquently, is really nothing more than, you know, kind of aligning ourselves with the process of life.
The creativity and the processes of life. Well, this has been very enlightening for me. Thank you for joining this conversation, because you know now where we need to go from here. So thanks, Matt, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks, Deepak. My best to you and to your team. Thank you for having me.